Welcome again to the Feminist Futures Institute. My name is Tamika Middleton. I am Deputy Director at Women's March. I use she, her pronouns. I am joining you all from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm so grateful to be with you all. This is the fourth of our 8 web episode series, and we hope that you continue to join us for the next 4 weeks. So last week we met Kelly Robinson and Paris Hatcher, and we learned that change is the only constant and that contradictions are all around us. We learned that to build a truly feminist future, we must confront our own past and reconcile with it. And we learned that along the way, we are going to mess up, and that it's how we pick ourselves up and forward that will shape change. If you missed that session or any of the previous sessions, you can check them out at womensmarch.com/feminist futures. So over the next 4 weeks, we'll continue to explore these questions. How did we get here? And where do we go from here? We'll listen from and learn about everyday women across history who've navigated these waters before, and we'll radically envision where we go from here. Today's session, I'm very excited. Resistance and Defiance will be anchored by Noor, who is Women's March's Director of Digital Advocacy, and Paulina Helm-Hernandez, who is dear to my own heart. So I'm very excited that she's here to join us today. Stay tuned. We will start shortly. See you soon.
Hello, everybody. It is so wonderful to see all of the places that everybody's coming from in the comments, in the chat. Welcome. We are so grateful to have you here with us for this conversation. And Paulina and I are going to start off by introducing ourselves, who we are, where we're coming from. So I'll kick us off, and then we're going to get into a conversation about resistance and defiance and what fuels us in this fight for our feminist future. So hello, my name is Noor, pronouns she, hers. I am calling in from Washington, D.C., occupied Piscataway land. I am currently the Director of Digital Advocacy at the Women's March. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm a Muslim American. I moved to the U.S. in 2008 from Pakistan, which is where my family still lives. So I go back pretty often when I can to see them and to spend time with them. Still navigating the waters and getting to know this country. It still feels pretty new to me at times. And my personal background is from a history of anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-militarist organizing, specifically around U.S. Foreign policy and warfare in my country and in the region that I come from. And that has really propelled me to dig in deeper, to be bolder. And right now, I find a lot of my work still in the civil rights, justice for Muslims, for immigrants arena. And at the Women's March, I have had some wonderful experiences organizing our base, both in DC but around the country. Whether it's a strategic small direct action, whether it's a march with thousands of people, this is what gives me life. This is what gives me oxygen. This is what propels me to go further and further and think bolder and sharper every single day. So I'm so excited to be here with you all and talk about the beauty and the joy, but also the contradictions and complexities of protest and defiance and the lessons that we can learn from these moments. And I'm overjoyed to be here with Paulina. And Paulina, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Noor. It's so nice to be with you here today. Hi, folks. It's so nice to be with you all. It's so wonderful to see folks logging in from all over the place. My name is Paulina Helm-Hernandez. I am calling you all from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm here for a little bit, which y'all know is also native. It's also occupied native land. And I live in Louisville, Kentucky, which, again, is also occupied native land. I go by she and her. I am the former co-director of an organization called Southerners on New Ground, SONG for short. And I've been an organizer and somebody that's been just politicized by movement, really, from a young age. My mother is also an organizer and came into movements at a pretty early age and really politicized by the anti-violence movement, the migrant rights movement, the feminist movement, and the LGBTQ movement, I would say, gender justice work writ large. And it's so lovely to be with you all today. I definitely was like, ruminating a lot about all of my moments of resistance and defiance, both internally and spiritually and emotionally, and then outwardly, when I got a chance to, to really channel a lot of my energy into collective efforts with other people that shared my values and my vision and share the, just, those moments of internal defiance and our longing to like be connected to people that are also share their vision and their values. So it's so nice to be with you all today to just, chop it up a little bit more and share a little bit of, I don't know, a little bit of insight from some of the struggles that we've been a part of. And, the good, the difficult, and the transformational, to be really honest, because there's so much transformation to be found in this work, along with, a lot of really hard things. But I feel like at the end of the day, a lot of the reason why a lot of us are here today is because we know that another world is possible and we know we need each other in order to build that. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much, Paulina. So for folks that have been part of the Feminist Futures series, the Institute before, you know that we do some storytelling. And as Paulina mentioned, like chopping up those stories and figuring out what lessons we want to carry with us. And Paulina and I are going to be sharing some stories, some moments of resistance and defiance. But I'm hoping that we can hear a little bit from you all in the chat and in the comments as well about moments of resistance and defiance in your own lives. So you'll see a question pop up on your screen, but if there is a moment in your lives where you have felt defiant, whether that is personally, whether that is in movement, we would love to hear about it. So feel free to put that in the chat, and that'll help be a foundation for this conversation as we carry forward. So I'm going to kick us off, Paulina. And I see a comment of an example of defiance. I'm going to start off by giving us one, and Paulina's going to give us a few as well. So when I think about a moment of resistance or defiance, what I wanted to talk about here was January 20th, 2017, which to me is known by the nickname, the acronym of G20. So it's actually the day that Donald Trump was being inaugurated into office. And many of us were thinking about the Women's March. Many of us were stressed about the inauguration. People were preparing for January 21st, right? But a number of activists from DC, as well as around the country, had been planning for months to actually shut down his inauguration and make it very difficult for people to be able to get inside and actually put this person into a seat of power. So what I want to share with you is sort of like the not so glamorous pieces, right? Not the photos, not necessarily the posters, not necessarily the moment of adrenaline, but some of that hard work and sweat and tears that goes into the infrastructure, right? Like the actual structures that keep people fed, that keep people clothed, that get people housed. Like that's what I'm here to talk about. And I really felt like that moment, which was January 20th, 2017, was a moment of defiance and learning for me. So I was an organizer that was a part of one very small blockade. That was a part of many blockades that happened that day. And I was surrounded by an incredible group of DC organizers, medics, trainers from across movements and organizations. And they called themselves the Welcoming Committee. So I'm here to talk about some of the magic that I got to experience and participate in and learn from, right? So what's really great about that moment, what was really great about that mobilization is that it was completely untethered to a single organization. There were no logos, there was no, these are three people calling the shots. It was truly grassroots and autonomous. So every few weeks, beginning in, I think around November, the year before, we started holding public assemblies, public mass meetings in the basement of a church that has been a home for activists in DC for a long time. And those meetings started off with 20 people, 30 people, 100 people. And by the final meeting, we were at about 300 people. And we used a model that some of you might have experienced before. And if you have, let us know in the chat. But it is called a spokes council. And what a spokes council looks like is that's a really good way to bring together a large group of people and split them up into different working groups, affinity groups, which I'll get into, or other different clusters where they can make decisions, get work done, build relationships, and honestly, just move in formation and in rhythm with each other. So what that ended up looking like was that I was participating in the spokes for a blockade that was called Communities Under Attack. And that was Muslim activists and immigrant organizers from around the DC area. And we were going to blockade one of the 12 checkpoints and screening sites into Trump's inauguration. Something that was beautiful about this is that there were no secrets. Like I said, this was a public meeting, right? So anybody could come. We had a sign-in sheet. We weren't turning people away. And that comes with some risks, right? Like, yeah, we actually had some serious right-wing infiltrators, and we had to make some decisions about, okay, what are we going to move back from? How public do we want to be? Are there people that should be in these meetings when there's right-wing infiltrators there? And we decided we were going to forge ahead. Like we had planned too much, and there was nothing that we had to hide. So on the day of inauguration, we actually had 12 direct actions and one at each of the security checkpoints leading into the inauguration and the commencement ceremony. So anything ranging from, we had a climate blockade, we had a labor justice blockade, we had our blockade, we had the Movement for Black Lives and Allies blockade, we had a futurist feminist blockade, very apt for the session. And 7 of the 12 entrances were actually completely and permanently shut down for the day. And I like to think, when I look at those photos, right, of people, mocking the show at the inauguration, it was because of people power. It wasn't because people didn't want to be there. Like, people elected this human into office. It was because they actually couldn't get there. And that's because we were literally blocking the exits. That doesn't mean that the day didn't end it did not end on a good note, right? Like, DC police deployed pepper spray, tear gas, crowd control grenades, and arrested hundreds of people that were saddled with some really serious charges, including decades in prison for years. And before charges were dropped, things were really dicey. There were some real tensions and conflicts that came up in the community. But what I want to leave with this anecdote is that I learned and started to really respect the beauty of infrastructure in these in these moments, social movement infrastructure, right? People learned how to make decisions in small groups. People learned how to communicate and land on shared messaging and talking points. There was a medics collective that absorbed thousands of people from the area that wanted to be healers on the streets, that wanted to learn how to respond, right, to when pepper spray was being used, when somebody felt sick, when somebody felt anxious, what were the different practices that we could incorporate. And we also had an art collective, we had a legal collective, and I really feel like those relationships that were formed through that mobilization is the victory, is the win. As much as those actions gave us so much joy and so much fuel to know that it worked, we also know that what lasted and what I'm still seeing the impacts of today is that people learn new things. Like, people learn how to be in right relationship with each other. People learn how to sort through some sticky situations. People also are the people that learn how to be medics there are still medics. Like, people that learn how to do jail support that day are still part of the jail support collectives. And that is what I really truly think is transformative about these spaces, is that when the cameras are gone, when the press release is out, when the photos are up, what remains? And what remains to me is really the evidence, right, of the strength of a movement, of the longevity of a movement, of the power of people. So that's the story I wanted to share, because I remember feeling so scared, when I saw my friends being arrested en masse, when I found out that they were facing decades in prison. But what gave me hope is knowing that now I know all of these people with skills, serious skills, sharpened over years and years, that we can use anytime something like this happens again. And it's going to happen, right? And the beauty is that it keeps growing. The beauty is that we keep sharing. The beauty is that it gets bigger and bigger every time. So I stopped being afraid. I remember being so scared that day. And I remember just looking around. I'm like, now I know exactly like who the 10 people I'm going to call when I'm having an action where I need to make sure that there are going to be medics, or like when I'm feeling a little unsure about the legal repercussions of something. I know exactly who I can call because they have been through this before. And to me, that is the scaffolding that really just brings so much to our movements, and that stays for a very long time. So that's what I wanted to share today to kick us off, Paulina, because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot.
Thank you so much, Noor. I remember that day as well, and feeling so far away from DC and so close to you all at the same time. um, and I wanted to take us back a little bit in time to 2010. If y'all remember, Barack Obama was our sitting president during that time. And, for a lot of us, it was a really exciting political moment where we had seen the first, the election of the first African American and Black president. And we're really thrilled to be actually like talking and engaging with federal level policies and even within the states that a lot of us lived in. At the time, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we were really beginning to see the kind of political divide, right? Beginning to rise up and a lot of the backlash that his presidency was beginning to face, and some of the mounting challenges from the right, and some of the mounting pressure from the left as well to deliver, right? To deliver on the issues that he had been elected on, and to deliver on the platform that he had been elected on. And then, if you'll remember too, during that time, one of the major issues, which continues to be a major issue, a major polarizing issue, was immigration. And so the Obama administration had both named, that immigration reform was one of their priorities. And so a lot of the state legislatures across the Southeast and across the country and began to really figure out what they were going to do at the state level if that actually came to pass, and kind of how to get ahead of the race of any progressive moves on immigration by making it really hard at the local and at the state level, right? And really ramping up enforcement and just the criminalization of immigrant people and undocumented people. So for a little bit of background, I'm Chicana, Mexicana. I come from Veracruz, Mexico, and my family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 12. And so I came to the U.S. when I was in 8th grade, and went to school in North Carolina and went to high school and college there. And so a lot of what I remember being politicized, honestly, as a young person living in North Carolina, was very much around what the conditions of the Black community was facing in North Carolina, and some of the ways that racism and structural racism was being placed upon them, and then kind of being transferred and expanded to also include Latinos and other folks of color that were also coming into the state. There was also a growing South Asian community, a growing African community, a growing Muslim community. And so it was beginning to just, the state began to transform, and other states in the South were experiencing similar things. Georgia is the same, or so similar parallel timelines, if you will. And one of the issues that really became, top of mind for us when I was working at Song at the time, during that really beginning to sort of see the way that they were beginning to be mounting challenges. And then in the states that we were, so primarily Song works in the states in the Southeast, but we have a national base of folks that are also keeping an eye out for regressive policies and things that affect both the LGBTQ community and other communities that face just structural oppression, and what opportunities we had really to build a movement that was built on unity, and actually being able to sort of talk about some of the issues that could bring us together, because we were all being targeted by the same policies, right? Or being criminalized in some of the same ways. And so we began to really, get a little bit deeper into some of trying to understand, I would say, to your point, Noor, what was the infrastructure in Georgia around that was supporting the migrant rights movement, and Song joined at the time the Georgia Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition in around 2011, because in 2010, one of the things that happened is that Arizona introduced the bill SB 1070. For those of you in Arizona, I don't have to explain this, but it essentially was called or dubbed the Show Me Your Papers bill, which was really very much sort of building on that, on the anti-immigrant movement's desire to just scale up and do mass deportations and do what a lot of people call dragnet operations, meaning to just increase the ways in which our people have to interface with the police, and then that becomes a way that they enter the detention system, right? Or that they have county jails and other things, and then ICE detainers are placed, and then they get folks who are being funneled into ICE detention, or having removal orders or detainers or what have you. And so one of the things that we began to also see shape up was that a lot of the fight in Arizona was also being mounted in a really amazing way. There was a campaign that was launched at the time called the Not One More Deportation campaign, because they were also clocking that in 2010 when it happened in Arizona, and 2013 it also came to Alabama as a HB or House Bill 56, and then Georgia came in 2014 as House Bill 87. And so they were beginning, like in Arizona, when they mounted their fight, they recognized that this was going to be a bill that if nobody fought back against it in Arizona, it could so quickly spread, and that they were really concerned, right? Like by the way that the police had always that the police, and also in Arizona they had a Sheriff Arpaio. So for some of you that are more familiar with that particular character, he is he just was a sheriff that really, I would say, symbolized what it meant to have a really hard local enforcement against immigration and against people of color, and a really, I would say, like a pretty white nationalist way of enforcing like local policy, and or kind of embedding that into the sheriff's sort of mandate around local enforcement. And so at that time, because they were mounting such a huge fight to get Arpaio out of office, they were beginning to recognize the role that different sheriffs across the South were having to sort of expand those harmful policies across the country, and then beginning to see a lot of the state, a lot of those sort of issues right to the state level and the state policies, or into kind of introduce this, state level bills or state legislation. And so when it came to Alabama in 2013 and it came to Georgia in 2014, they were all copycat bills that were essentially replicating the exact same thing that the Arizona law had introduced, which were just show me your papers bills. Essentially the police could stop anybody in a routine traffic stop and ask them for their immigration papers or proof of citizenship. Another measure of that was also that it criminalized mixed status families by, for example, placing criminal charges on people that were given rights, for example, to people. So if you were also stopped at a traffic stop and one of your passengers, for example, was not a citizen or a documented person, you could also be facing criminal charges. So they began to kind of expand sort of not just their focus on undocumented people or people with, but also to mixed status families, and then to our entire community, really anybody that had any compassion for the Indian community or was in relationship, right, or in community with other undocumented folks could now be facing charges. And so in Georgia, like, I have to be really honest, like Georgia is such an amazing civil rights state. We know that so much of the legacy of Georgia, a lot of the infrastructure that does exist is also the legacy of the civil rights movement, where people have been very deeply politicized by white nationalism and criminalization. And there's such a political generosity from the Black community around how do we actually have a shared analysis of what we're facing, and how are we sort of talking about immigration and understanding immigration in a way that is also, that it's not, it's not a one-time event, but it's actually a wedge issue meant to divide the rest of our communities, right? And that there is a way that the right and the conservative movements are very strategic about those wedge issues, because they know that there's so much resistance to be had in this country against oppression, that there have to be sort of specific things to divide us and to make sure that we're not fighting for the same cause, or to just kind of create more space between our movements, or more sort of gaps between our political unity across issues. And so it was really interesting at the time, being a part of SONG, which is it was predominantly an LGBTQ organization, predominantly a queer and trans organization, cross-class, multiracial. And there was really, just identifying this opportunity to engage. And for a lot of us, like the original Defiance, I'll be really frank with you all, was for a lot of us that came from immigrant families, was to deal with our own shame, about our immigration stories and how we're made to feel, around nationality, or how we're made to feel because our parents have accents, or some of us have accents, or some of us come from working class communities, and have a really hard time ascending economically than other communities. And so there is a lot of the kind of, I would say, structural challenges that we face. It is because there is a cultural creation in there too, right? There is a sort of an embedding of shame that a lot of us have internalized. And if, it was one of the first things that we talked about when we joined the Georgia Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, was in realizing how many people were actually explicitly pro-immigration, and how many people were like, well, we just want to see how bad it is, and then we can make a plan. And we're like, it's bad, bad. Like, how much long, like how bad does it have to be for some people to actually be mobilized or be willing to sort of, do more political education with their base. And he wasn't realizing that I was like, oh, some coalitions actually just don't have the power to move together, or like they're so centric that like it felt like we were going to, I'll be really honest, like I remember like when we joined the coalition, we immediately identified with this organization, which is the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, because they had one of the most sort of robust bases of undocumented people, the most robust basis of working class women, a lot of Latinas, of course, that were also very concerned with what was happening in our state and really building political power within the Latinx community and within, particularly with women, around confronting this, issues of immigration, issues around, and also like their kids were facing in school, public housing, all kinds of issues. And so we really just began to kind of, we were like, okay, so we're actually in a position where we can stay in this coalition and just go along to get along, to be really frank, or we can strike out on our own and actually form a left flank that has a chance of pushing back against this House bill in Georgia and actually help to scale up the migrant rights movement in Georgia. And so that's what we chose to do. We chose to kind of, we did our loving goodbyes or kind of, like we're still in a relationship with the coalition, but we have to start. We have to join other efforts that are happening nationally that are much more bolder, that are actually willing to confront the state violence that our people are facing and are actually willing to talk about what it takes to stop deportations and what it takes to actually invite people at the local level into a local fight that is actually willing to confront really the beast, that is like the detention and immigration system. And so for that, in Georgia, it's really symbolic too, because there's also a detention center, and it's one of the places where people also go for immigration court. And there's, a number of immigration judges that are also really just terrible in Georgia, and just had a really high rate of, just like both like turning people away, but also just really harsh rulings. That included a lot of the time, a lot of family separations. And that was one of the central issues really to us joining that fight, was around the question of family separation. And so in joining that fight, we also joined the Not One More Deportation campaign that the folks in Arizona had helped to start in collaboration with the National Day Labor Organizing Network at the time. And it also brought us so much closer to all of this like badass feminist organizers. To be honest, like we just did not know that we're like coming from the Southwest, who are like, we've been dealing with this for like 500 years, y'all. Like a lot of the fights that are happening in between the U.S.-Mexico border, and the people that had been politicized long ago by what it meant to sort of live next to such a wound in Latin America and like in relationship to Mexico and the U.S. And then to that really like the question of decolonization was so central to them. And, that in order to mount a fight, we actually had to tell the truth about the land, about the power of this, like about the ways that the white nationalist movement has garnered power, that it has been by defining whiteness, right? And by defining citizenship and by telling people that the only way to be safe in this country is to be a citizen. And then we know that for a lot of folks of color that are citizens, born and raised in the U.S., we know that that's a lie, right? We know that there are so many stories. I don't even have to tell you, I'm like preaching to the choir here, but like we know that that is not the case. Women experience all kinds of oppression, regardless, like there are so many things like citizenship, like it's been such a symbolic sort of thing to dangle over, undocumented people and immigrant people, that we have to have a really honest conversation with Southern Black folks and the Southern Black community in Georgia to see what is actually on the other side of this conversation. Because what we can't do is tell our people that, citizenship is the fix-all, and that if we just get these papers, and some of us are going to be safer at the expense of everybody else who, like didn't have access to that. And so Tamika Middleton, who also introduced us earlier, was a part of that. She was already a part of Project South, and we also helped to start Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. So we were already very connected. She was one of those folks that was also central to that conversation, to be like, what are we actually trying to build in Georgia, and how do we build a multiracial fight that also it helps to lift up other oppressed people, and also helps to show the immigrant community that there's so much resistance to be had, but there's also so much possibility here. And so from that campaign, like there were so many moments of defiance, y'all. But one of the first things that we chose to do it's basically to begin to also just drive the conversation around it, to actually begin to sort of create space for a different narrative. And so that meant that we went, we had to, we were really trying to think about ways that we could do both, narrative change, cultural change, but also that direct actions, like that there's, like the role of direct actions in terms of being able to sort of bring the issue to bear in a really public way, and also bring a really polarizing conversation where we're asking people to actually choose sides, and we're actually asking people to step with us, to step forward with us, to take in some collective risk in order for all of us to be able to have collective liberation. And so through that work, we were able to engage, at least for Song's Base, like we was a collaboration between Song, GLAR, and some of our other allied organizations, where people were able to sort of they're really people like self-elected, or like, tapped into saying like who felt like they could face the legal consequences of potentially being detained in front of the detention center if we actually did escalate, and if people actually were willing to be, like face arrest, face the risk of arrest. And so it brought forth a really powerful conversation and a really powerful strategy that brought, honestly, like for Song, like it just meant that a lot of our queer and trans folks were like stepping up and saying, I want to learn more. Like I already face a lot of like risk in my daily life. Like this would be one of the what does it mean for me to put myself on the line, And there were some people that we were like, frankly, you face too much legal risk. Like we want to be accountable to your folks and your family. Like, what does this mean, in terms of like privilege, and in terms of for people that like, had mixed status families and other things. Like it was a little bit more complicated. And so we got to talk about all of those dynamics, like about how people were leveraging their privilege and their power, and who felt confident doing so, who felt like they needed to, like go talk to their parents and their families, and in order to make that decision together and create enough room and space for us to actually step into that, and with a lot of integrity, because we were also seeing a lot of actions take place that were putting people in harm's way. And sometimes people didn't know, like to Noor's point, like some people didn't know the legal consequences, frankly, that they were facing until they were in the county jail, trying to figure that out. And we didn't want to put our folks in that position. And it was a really powerful, both like negotiation, but also a space that just cracked a lot of the power open. So a lot of folks that also are part of the Women's March were part of that, of those direct actions. It meant that, like we were both like stopping buses from leaving the Georgia Detention Center, taking people to the Atlanta airport to be deported those days. So we like started ramping up a lot of our organizing between 2014 and 2016 to fight back against that. And it meant all kinds of things. People were locking themselves to the gates of those detention centers. People were doing what we call Migra Watch, which is like that they were keeping tabs on what was happening with different counties, and how different counties were also doing, how different people were sort of shifting their kind of law enforcement to sort of, begin to preempt HB 87 before it had even become a law. And so there was a lot of ways that we were also to just, work with folks across the state to bring people that wanted to come to the Capitol in Atlanta to be a part of those actions. And then for people that couldn't, to help decentralize some of those actions and some of that resistance in a way that people felt like they could do, like what felt possible to do at the local level. What were they willing to do at the local level? And for some people, it meant hosting a lot of town halls at the local level, and inviting the sheriff to talk about, what their local policy was, or it was to host interfaith conversations with their community and their church community around the consequences of this and what was happening. So it looked like all kinds of different ways, but it taught me so much about resistance and defiance, to be honest, because direct action was very central, but it was not the only entry point into joining this fight. We were trying to set a tone of resistance and defiance because we wanted to also show that those of us that are most directly impacted are willing to take that risk. We are willing to do it because we face that risk every day, and that to actually do that on purpose and be deliberate about that, like you come out a different person on the other side. You come out a different person on the other side. And of course, we have to talk about a lot of those things, like what it meant for when people would actually be prepared to be physically touched by the police and be like forcibly picked up and dragged away, and what it took to do that, and like we prayed together, we ate together, we like we did a lot of things, a lot of ritual to also like prepare ourselves spiritually as a group to be able to hold that, to be able to hold the tension, and to actually be able to make decisions that felt smart in the moment, and that felt like we were accountable for each other's safety, and that we were actually consenting to kind of the shared risk that we were facing. And there was so much work that flowed out of that, to be like honest, like a lot of that also then turned into folks from the LGBTQ community in Atlanta, some which part of Song and some who were not, were part of a lot of other sister organizations, said, you know what? We see that they began to, they were joining the Georgia mobilizations against HB 87 and against, the deportations. And or joining the Not One More Deportation campaign. And we got so many calls from LGBT community members saying, we want to be a part of the security team. We want to be part of the safety team. We want to be part of hosting. Can we bring food? What can we do? And a lot of people that have come from immigrant families too, that they themselves, a lot of them had grown up in the US. They're like, I actually never really engaged with my family's immigration story, and it's been so painful. And this is like something that I can do to step a little bit closer into my own truth, and into my own sort of spiritual integrity about what's happening to other folks, because my family didn't have to face those same risks. And so it was a really, I feel like, what it actually has built in Georgia is that, like, it has led to a lot of things that are now possible in Georgia, and why Georgia is like so much on the block in terms of a civil rights state, and a state that is like really been defined by a lot of resistance and defiance in the Mid-South. Not to exceptionalize it from, other southern states. There's so many amazing fights that have happened in all of those states, including the fight that happened in Alabama to counter HB 56, including the fights, like a lot of the states, including some of the states where there have been seeing a lot of this resistance around immigration, that have been really stepped up to build the kind of working coalitions that are actually worth investing in, and that are actually building political alignment, so that people can see the power of collective defiance, can feel the kind of political cover of being part of a movement that takes our risks seriously and is willing to, and that takes our sacrifices to build movement seriously. I feel like that's one of the most untalked about things, is the kind of sacrifices that people have to make in movements, and how we honor that in our work. So I'll stop there.
Oh, Paulina, I'm very, very inspired and moved by all the lessons you shared with us. But in particular, I think the way that you were talking about sort of this like moment, this campaign that really met this theme of resistance and defiance that continues, and how it was, immigrants and immigration as like a wedge issue that is used to polarize communities, polarize geographies. And I'm curious sort of like how you navigated some of those political contradictions and some of those complexities, right? I know you shared a little bit of like the lessons, the coalitions, the purposeful organizing with bases that were willing to go a little bit further. And I feel like sometimes we try so hard to stretch our imagination to be like, this is how we can connect our issues. This is how our stories connect. And people spend so much time trying to make it happen. And over the past year in particular, I've been trying to simplify my approach to it as an organizer. It's not that hard. Like, if I'm talking about people that are in Del Rio, Texas, or Haitian immigrants that are trying to get to this country, like, it doesn't take me too much to dig around to find out about how the climate crisis is resulting in hundreds and thousands of refugees, including people from the Caribbean, that have no choice but to escape not only political turmoil, but also climate catastrophe, right? Like, we don't need to pay people thousands of dollars to come up with, the perfect messaging, when our people already know this, when it is part of their experiences. And like, how much more important is it for us to take those intentional steps to be like, yeah, we do actually need to have an assembly. We actually do need to have a storytelling circle. We actually do need to have, well planned and intimate times for our members and our leadership to actually meet, right? And actually share these stories and prepare them to go through that, and to be able to live those experiences and share them with each other, which I feel sometimes we miss those steps. And that makes those contradictions something bigger than they need to be, or those complexities something bigger than it needs to be, when it's already inside of us. So that's like what I've been really gravitating towards, is let's just talk it out. Let's just talk about who we are. And trust me, we're not going to have to think that hard about it. And I'm curious what your approach has been.
That's a really great question. And then I have a question for you. I honestly, it just taught me a lot about tiered engagement, about how not to leave people behind, but also to be willing to move with the people that are ready to move. And I think we realized that there were so many people that had made that decision a long time ago, that they were pro-immigration, and that they were against borders and colonization, and that, that it was going to take a huge movement, like an actual, intersectional movement united with other movements for justice, including the feminist movement, to actually redefine the issue of immigration in this country, and to disallow the right from dividing us based on that, or using that as a wedge issue. And it just reminded me, like we learned a lot of lessons during that time, but one of them was that coalitions are not home. They're not often political homes. There are some really exceptional coalitions. So, definitely feel free to push back. There's some wonderful ones. But I know that, for us, it was just a moment to realize that like coalitions are spaces to build or it was a space for us to build with other organizations that have a collective read and to be able to sort of, be able to kind of see the widest kind of field of opportunity, right? What were all of the different places that it was possible to intervene and who was best positioned to go in on some of that stuff, So there were a number of groups, frankly, that like did not come along with us to the direct actions, but they were legal advocacy organizations, who began to develop legal resources for their community and their base and translating that, in many languages. For one, so one of them was, particularly working with the Asian and Pacific Islander community, and that was their role. Like within their lane, like they were very clear that they wanted to build the advocacy capacity of the API community in Georgia. And we were like, we are there. We are here for that. And if you have some people that want to join the direct actions, you let us know, or people that want to join some of the kind of organizing, some of the grassroots organizing stuff. So it was a way to also, to also respect, the lane that people have chosen oftentimes. Like, doesn't mean, we all don't have to have the exact same strategy to be able to roll together. And I think that there is a lot of, obviously there's a lot of judgment within movements about like what lane people choose and how people, like stay or don't stay in their lane. And I'm not a fundamentalist about it, to be honest. With Alicia Garza, I'm like, do what you like. Like, and I respect people's autonomy to kind of, find organically what their place and role is in movement. But I think with that comes the accountability of like respecting the fact that we need a really broad, robust movement with infrastructure that is like engaging millions of people. And that's been part of my, honestly, like always one of my struggles with like, with organizing is that, I want to organize with like, I'm a grassroots organizer that I love community groups. I love like neighborhood meetings. I love like those kinds of things where you really got to get to pick apart the local context. And we know that like we need like to be engaging like millions of people, and so what does it mean to build the containers that can actually, like can hold that? And we learned that to do that through the Not One More Deportation campaign. Song was not a campaign organization. We had not led a campaign. We had not like really been like, we didn't have that wasn't one of our muscles. Like we did a lot of convenings, base building and networking and political education, And so it was an opportunity for us to just like also like build our direct action and like and our strategic thinking muscle around campaigns as vehicles, but that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And that actually their efforts are to leverage, that moment. Their efforts are to sort of create mass entry into movement. And so it taught me to just be a lot more nimble, to be honest, and like less in my feelings too, like
networking. I hear you completely. It's like letting go of control. It's in some ways can be really hard, but at the same time, like sometimes those sacrifices really are worth it when we are just spreading our net wider. That is my last word, and I know we have to wrap up. But Paulina, I loved having this conversation with you, and I hope that we can have many more conversations like this. And thank you, everybody, for being here with us and listening. And I hope that we managed to impart some knowledge and maybe inspire you in your own resistance and defiance as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and sharing your stories. It's so wonderful to hear to what each of you are bringing and like in your heart about some of these questions and some of these issues. We appreciate you so much.